Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Robbie Madrigal. I'm one of the organizers of today's program. We're honored to have with us today Dr. Hannah Walker, Assistant Professor of Government at UT Austin, who will discuss her book, Mobilized by Injustice, Criminal Justice Contact, Political Participation and Race. We'll put a link in the chat to the book. Before I introduce Dr. Walker, I'd like to give a land acknowledgement. We recognize that California State University San Bernardino sits on the territory and ancestral land of the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians. We recognize that every member of the California State University San Bernardino community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1965. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold California State University San Bernardino more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. As mentioned, our guest today is Dr. Hannah Walker. I had an opportunity to read her book. It's engagingly written, meticulously researched, and has a compelling narrative structure that integrates the voices of the marginalized and peripheralized, centering their experiences with various forms of the U.S. carceral apparatus. Dr. Walker's research examines the impact of the criminal justice system on American democracy, with special attention to minority and immigrant communities. She previously served as an assistant professor of political science and criminal justice at Rutgers University and a postdoctoral fellow with the Prisons and Justice Initiative at Georgetown University. She received her PhD in 2016 from the University of Washington. And please join me in welcoming Professor Hannah Walker to Cal State San Bernardino. It's all yours, Hannah.
Thank you so much, Professor Madrigal, for that introduction. I really appreciate it. Let me get my screen situated here. Okay, so as Professor Madrigal noted, I'm going to be talking to you today about my book, Mobilized by Injustice, which examines the impact of experiences with the criminal justice system on political attitudes and behavior. There we go. Okay, so Dina is an activist in the city of Seattle who I met while she was working on a campaign to protest the expansion of a juvenile detention center in the city of Seattle's historic Black neighborhood. Dina became politicized by watching her brother negotiate the system, experiencing repeated short stints in jail, and navigating the perils associated with reentry. As a consequence of watching him go through this, Dina's ideas about how the system works began to change, and she began to view it as a force for group-based inequality and is not geared to protect people like her, saying to me, for me and for a lot of people who come from poor communities, communities of color, safety is not a thing that exists right now. For those of us who are impacted by prisons, we see every day our safety being taken away. For every family member I lose, I'm less safe. That's a thing that's real for people whose communities are over-policed. That's a thing that's real for people whose families are kidnapped by the state. So concluding that the system is a force for group-based inequality prompted Dina to become active in efforts to resist the expansion of the detention center in Seattle. And her story is not unique, but it's recognizable to many activists across the country who organized to do things like end stop and frisk in New York City, who mobilized to protest police brutality in Ferguson, and again, to protest the same brutality after the murder of George Floyd in 2020, and lobbied for restorative justice reforms in cities like DC. Minorities and the poor disproportionately have involuntary interactions with law enforcement, and policing practices aimed at preempting crime make contact with the system a very real and frequent possibility for those who are viewed as criminal by the state based on where they live or how they look and dress. And so as a consequence, nearly 30% of adults have a criminal record, and almost half of Black men are arrested before they turn 25. But for every person who's stopped, arrested, and incarcerated, there's a network of additional folks who, by virtue of their relational connection to the criminal justice system, witness the criminal justice system in action. And so I call this sort of secondary contact, I call it proximal contact. And scholars estimate that nearly half of Black Americans have an incarcerated family member. And like Dina, who I just quoted, and who I interviewed for this project, and whose story kind of anchors the book and weaves its way throughout the book. Those with proximal contact often learn civic lessons by watching their loved ones negotiate the system. Researchers find that all types of contact, both personal and proximal, decrease voting and trust in government. And scholars argue that negative experiences with the criminal justice system demobilize and lead people to withdraw from political life because they send the message to custodial citizens and their families that their negative experiences with the system are due to their own poor choices. Indeed, the negative consequences of contact are so profound that it leads Lerman and Weaver, who are the authors of one of the landmark works on this topic, Arrested Citizenship, it leads them to write that the racial socialization of the criminal justice system holds little potential for resistance because it regularly conveys to its wards that their fates are due to their choices alone. Existing research has little to say about the participation of activists like Dina in Seattle, Ferguson, Baltimore, Minneapolis, Austin, and elsewhere. And so this project therefore asks the question, under what conditions do individuals become politically mobilized by their experiences with the criminal justice system? And under what conditions do they become demobilized? And then I further ask and examine in the book the extent to which these outcomes vary among white, Black, and Latinx Americans. Okay, so just to put it very simply, in Mobilized by Injustice, I argue that individuals become mobilized when they interpret their experiences through the lens of injustice, when they connect their experiences to a larger set of narratives, a larger set of institutional biases that they understand as targeting them on the basis of group affiliation like race, class, or ethnicity. And so rather than internalizing those experiences as a product of their own poor choices or the failings of a loved one, criminal justice contact can catalyze political action when individuals externalize those experiences and locate the source of those experiences in those kinds of institutional biases. I argue that the mobilizing potential of a sense of injustice is greater for those with proximal contact than for their custodial counterparts, since they face fewer efficacy and resource barriers to participation, particularly as compared to those who have experienced long-term incarceration. Although what I want to make clear, and one thing that I try to tease out in the book, is that although mobilization is less likely for people who have experienced long-term incarceration, the sense of injustice still has the capacity to mobilize. And very often in the kinds of interviews that I've done for the book and for projects elsewhere, individuals who have personally been incarcerated are the most politicized by those experiences and the most active in trying to create change. So I further anticipate that the mobilizing effect of contact should be greater for Black Americans who have a clear narrative through which to understand their carceral experiences as unjust, one that connects the criminal justice system to past iterations of racial control, what I call the narrative of the new Jim Crow. Latinos, for their part, face heightened scrutiny by local police that is unique to this group for reasons related to immigration enforcement. And so following from decades of research demonstrating the broad mobilizing capacity of punitive immigration policy, which cross-cuts an otherwise diverse community, I argue that Latinos are most likely to be mobilized by their experiences when they connect those experiences to immigration, either because they've been stopped on the street and questioned about their citizenship status, or because they have a loved one who's been threatened with deportation. White Americans, for their part, are both less likely to have contact with the criminal justice system and more likely to assume a priori that the system functions justly. But nevertheless, they are not exempt from involuntary experiences with the criminal justice system. They're not exempt from the violence that they may experience while incarcerated, and thus the loved ones are not exempt from witnessing that by proxy either. But the ways in which they're uniquely targeted tend to operate through class, and so I argue that white Americans will arrive at a sense of injustice and be mobilized by those narratives when they're leveraging class-based narratives. Okay, and then the last piece of my theory that I want to just talk with you a bit about today, before I just move into talking about some of the research and how I did it and what I found, is that I argue that mobilization that results from experiences with the criminal justice system is most likely to manifest outside of the ballot box. So that research that I told you a little bit about previously that really finds that people become demobilized by their experiences really focuses in on voting. And they find that all kinds of contact leads people to withdraw from electoral politics. And so part of what I'm arguing in the book is that just because people withdraw from electoral politics does not mean that they're alienated, that they're lost to political life, or that they've given up their sort of motivation or interest in creating political change. It's just that with voting, we're looking in the wrong place for that kind of mobilization. Instead, we should expect to see that mobilization manifest in other kinds of activities. And there are a couple of key reasons for this. First of all, politicians are most responsive to likely voters, and that leads them to neglect minorities and the poor. And so doing things like protesting, attending city council meetings, and so forth are often first steps to get one's issues on the agenda. Secondly, frustrations that arise from issues related to community policing don't necessarily occur neatly within the election cycle. So that is, elections come around at regular intervals, and non-voting activities offer, like protesting, offer an immediate outlet for concerns that arise from experiences with the criminal justice system. And then lastly, and perhaps most importantly, alienation from the political system might likewise be accompanied by a diminished belief in the efficacy of elections, even as a newly politicized consciousness that results from experiences with the criminal justice system compels participation outside of formal politics. Okay, so those are kind of the nuts and bolts of the arguments that I'm making in the book overall. What I want to do now is talk to you a little bit about the research that I did and what I found. And so my analytic strategy to try to assess some of these questions is multi-method. And so I rely throughout the course of the book primarily on survey data. And in the book, I draw on 6 different surveys to try to evaluate the questions that I'm asking here. I have a couple of surveys that are of the general population, but because I'm really interested in comparing and contrasting racial whites to Blacks and Latinos, I also have some other surveys that I draw on that help me sort of tease out some of those racial dynamics. But in addition to the surveys that I draw on, I also conducted 59 in-depth interviews with activists, advocates, and community members impacted by the criminal justice system. And I do this to try to tease out the sort of causal relationship between experiences with the criminal justice system, a sense of injustice, and downstream political behavior. And these interviews also prove very valuable in teasing out the sort of rich narratives that people draw on that are shaped by racialized experiences to try to explain their experiences as unjust, where Black Americans are drawing on a different kind of narrative than are Latinx and white Americans. So today I'm going to walk you through, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of my qualitative interviews, but I'm going to also draw on just three of the surveys that I used in the book. The National Crime and Politics Survey, which is one that I fielded myself, especially for this project, that includes all the sort of important measures of injustice, contact, and participation. I'm also going to draw on the 2016 ANES because that allows me to sort of validate the relationships that I observe in the National Crime and Politics Survey. And then I'm also going to draw on, in today's talk, I'm going to draw on the LNHIS, the Latino National Health and Immigration Survey, which was fielded in 2015, which again allows us to kind of tease out some of those dynamics that are really specific to the Latino community. Okay, so how did I measure proximal contact? In this talk, I'm going to be focusing mostly on proximal contact, and I'm happy to talk about why I do that in the Q&A. In order to measure proximal contact, the NCPS asked, what about someone you know, such as a close friend or family member? Do you know someone who's been arrested, charged, or questioned by the police, even if they weren't guilty, excluding minor traffic stops such as speeding? And in the NCPS, we find that about 30 to 35% overall of the full sample has some kind of proximal contact or responded to this question and said that they had proximal contact, a little bit higher among Black Americans, a little bit lower among white Americans. And then Latinx Americans in the NCPS, I think, come in right just above white Americans. In the ANES, didn't have quite as open of a measure. Instead, the ANES asked in the past 12 months whether any family member had been stopped or questioned by the police. And in the ANES, if I don't have the number in front of me correct right at this exact moment, but I believe it was about 19% of folks who said yes to this question. Okay. And so then I also wanted to measure a sense of injustice. And so in the NCPS, we asked a battery of 3 questions. And these injustice questions are crafted specifically around a sense of injustice relative to the criminal justice system and policing. So in the NCPS, we asked, how often do police do each of the following? Stop people in their cars or public places without good reason, treat people like me fairly and respectfully, and use excessive physical force or verbally abusive language. And so this has been coded into a scale where scoring very high on the scale indicates that you have maximum dissatisfaction with police in your community, and scoring very low on the scale indicates that you have maximum satisfaction with the police in your community. And in the ANES, unfortunately, we're just using the ANES to really validate the findings in the NCPS. Unfortunately, they didn't ask the same kinds of questions that I asked in the NCPS. And so we have to use a proxy. And so the proxy that we draw on is this question about discrimination. And it simply asks individuals how much discrimination they've faced in their life. Okay, so the first thing that I want to do is I want to talk to you a little bit about the relationship between proximal contact and perceived discrimination. And so what I'm showing you on the graph here is I'm showing you the likelihood or the impact of contact on perceived discrimination in the NCPS in the top row and the ANES on the bottom row. And these 2 bullet points are just among the total samples. And so what we can see is that there's a positive and statistically significant relationship between contact and injustice. Those who have had proximal contact are statistically likely to have higher levels of injustice relative to those without contact. But we also know that race shapes these kinds of experiences. It shapes the likelihood of having contact, and it also shapes the extent to which one is likely to view their experiences with the criminal justice system as unjust. And so for white Americans, we can see that relative to the total sample, and in part because they make up a large part of the sample, there still is a positive and significant relationship between contact and perceived injustice. But in the NCPS, it's not quite strong enough to achieve statistical significance, but there is still a relationship there. Okay, and so what the in-depth interviews have allowed me to do is try to tease out some of these narratives that people leverage to understand their experiences as unjust. And so Jared is a good example. Jared is a white working class guy in his early 40s at the time that I interviewed him, from Portland, Oregon, works in a plant. His proximal experiences come by way of his girlfriend, who was picked up for driving with a suspended license. As a consequence of that, she ended up having to spend a couple of nights in jail, and then she had to complete like terms of probation after that. And so in talking about that experience, he said, not one person was served by her experience except for the people who make a living from the system. And he went on to talk about how it complicated her life. It made it harder for her to be able to actually care for her children. And that rippled out to the entire family. And in talking about how he understood those experiences as unjust, and her experience in particular, he really focused in on class. And so what he said was, it has more to do with social class than anything else. I think in terms of SES, white people generally have it better off than African-American people do, which does something to explain why the criminal justice system is weighted that way. You don't see patrol cars cruising around affluent neighborhoods. You don't. They cruise around where I live, behind Walmart in the ghetto. So I think what's particularly telling about Jared's comments is that he's not denying that there is racial inequality in the system, but to the extent to which he views it as unjust, and the way he explains racial inequality centers class-based narratives. Okay, so Black Americans, in contrast, are a little bit, they're more likely to have contact with the criminal justice system, and the impact of contact on perceptions of injustice and discrimination is slightly larger for Black Americans than it is for their white counterparts. And as I noted, Black Americans are really drawing on the narrative of the new Jim Crow in order to explain their own experiences with the system as unjust. But that doesn't mean that their narratives are devoid of class. It's just that, sort of in contrast to what Jared is doing, where he centers class to explain racial inequality, Black Americans center race to explain all kinds of inequality, and they layer class-based narratives on top of race-based narratives. And they employ language that we as scholars would refer to as, racial capitalism. So Tanya is a good example. Tanya's father was incarcerated when she was a child. And in speaking about that experience and what she sort of learned, the way that it shaped her political attitude, she said, and how she came to understand the system as unjust, she said, I started recognizing the economics of the system, realizing that, that's free labor, people working for 30 cents an hour. Why wouldn't you want to recruit, knowing how big of a business the prison system is? That's what really opened my eyes to it. I'm like, oh, why not us? We were slaves before, why not be slaves now? They're still making bank off of us. This is a really clear example of, okay, there's a racial analysis is at the center of the narratives that she's drawing on to make sense of her experiences, but we cannot characterize these kinds of narratives as devoid of class. Instead, it's a sort of narrative of racial capitalism. Okay, so what about Latinos? Well, Latinos in the literature tend to sort of fall somewhere between their white and Black counterparts in terms of both the likelihood they are to have contact with the criminal justice system, and then the impact of contact on perceptions of injustice and discrimination. Here we can see in particular in the NCPS that the size of the effect is about midway between white and Black Americans. But this sort of cross-sectional snapshot that I've given you really obscures, I think, it really obscures the deeper experience that Latinos are having with the criminal justice system, and the complexities of navigating experiences with the criminal justice system when layered on top of race and class. There are questions of citizenship. Right. So Martin is a Latino in his mid-20s, or he was when I interviewed him. From Los Angeles. And he sort of was talking to me about his own experiences with police in his community, and the way that people in his community sort of thought about policing and the unique threat that policing represented for his community. So what he said was, around the community where I lived, a lot of parents were undocumented. So they were always in fear of ICE or immigration or police to come around. In that area, it was like Latino immigrants against politics, against ICE coming in and arresting people and deporting them. Growing up, I kind of felt like that. It was like, okay, it's either with US politics or with my family. I have to pick one or the other. I wanted to help my mom get papers, but I also wanted to help my dad not get deported or not get arrested. And so Martin's comments are really telling insofar as, again, like the police on the street are what make the threat of immigration and punitive immigration policy real in the everyday lives of Latinx Americans who are themselves, dealing with targeting by the criminal justice system because of their status as people of color, and then their added status as potentially non-citizens. And his story is also, further telling, because he's telling me this narrative on the way to explaining to me why he ended up becoming an advocate for immigrants' rights as a young adult. Okay, so now what I want to do is make that connection from, okay, contact, a sense of injustice, political participation. What should we expect, and what do we observe with respect to political participation? So in terms of voting, in both data sets, I drew on whether or not individuals said that they were registered to vote, and then for those who were registered, whether they'd voted in the most recent presidential election. And then in terms of non-voting, I draw on a traditional political participation scale, a battery that was in both, similar questions were in both the ANES and the NCPS. And It just asks individuals whether they've done things like signed a petition, attended a protest, attended a community meeting, and so forth. Okay, so the first thing that we're looking at here is we're looking at the impact of proximal contact on the one hand and injustice on the other, on the likelihood of being registered to vote on the left and the likelihood of having voted on the right. Again, this is in the NCPS. The total population is in dark blue. White Americans are in orange. Black Americans are in light blue, and then Latinos are in red. And so what we can see is that there's no real clear relationship between proximal contact or perceived injustice on either being registered to vote or having voted in the NCPS. And so this is those same relationships, but in the ANES. And again, we're not seeing clear with relationships, with the exception that among Latinos, proximal contact is negatively associated with voter turnout. Now, I've argued that this isn't particularly surprising. Instead, we should expect to see people who are mobilized by their experiences. We should expect to see that mobilization manifest in activities other than voting. So Phoebe and Melanie are a good example. They're active Black Lives Matter activists in Seattle. And so as I was interviewing them, I was asking them to talk to me a little bit about how they thought about voting and what kinds of other activities they found compelling and important to engage. And so Phoebe said, the people who are being targeted by the criminal justice system are not the ones who can vote. With that knowledge, voting is kind of for show almost. And then Melanie jumped in and she said, it's protesting, it's building relationships with council members, it's educating the community. You can't just vote to make change. And so Melanie's comments in particular, I think really speak to the way that activists are thinking about voting. And that is that they're thinking about it as one tool in their toolbox to try that they can employ to try to create change, but that the sort of broader strategy and thinking creatively about how to create change in their community, build power in their community, and then try to speak to politicians. They're thinking broadly about these things, and so voting is for them a little bit beside the point. And so David, who is a immigrants' rights activist in Los Angeles, sort of echoed that sentiment when he said, we thought it was not enough to do institutional advocacy. We had to do work in the community. During that time, there were raids in the community, and we would do immigrant know your rights sessions. We would work with local groups that were fighting for workers' rights because the workers were undocumented. And so again, it's this thinking broadly and creatively about the kinds of strategies that are important to employ given the needs of one's community. Okay, so now what I'm showing you here is I'm showing you the relationship between proximal contact and injustice, between those two variables, and not participation, other kinds of non-voting activities, and this is in the NCPS. And so we can see that among the total population, both proximal contact and perceived injustice are positively related with the likelihood of participating in other kinds of non-voting activities. Those relationships don't achieve significant statistical significance for any of our racial subgroups under study, but the coefficients are all trending in the same direction as proximal contact and perceived injustice. And the same is true within the context of the ANES, with the exception that for Black Americans in the ANES, proximal contact is positively and strongly associated with participation in other kinds of non-voting activities. But this isn't really what we want to know. What we really want to know is how contact impacts participation in the absence and the presence of a sense of injustice, where the theory or the hypothesis is that in the proximal contact will be associated with increased participation when individuals have a sense of injustice. And when they don't have a sense of injustice, in the absence of a sense of injustice, the expectation is that proximal contact will either not be associated with participation or it will be negatively associated with participation. And so in order to evaluate that hypothesis, I employ a moderation analysis where I interact proximal contact with perceptions of injustice. And so that's what these two graphs are showing you. They're showing you among the total population in the NCPS on the left and the ANES on the right, the relationship between perceived injustice and participation among those without contact, who are denoted by little squares, and those who have had contact, which are denoted by circles. And so what we can take away from this is that contact is really associated with heightened consistently associated with a heightened likelihood of participation when it's combined with high levels of injustice. And for those who have contact but have low levels of injustice, on the far left of the graph, there is no difference in their likelihood of participating. And so this graph breaks that moderation analysis in the NCPS out among racial subgroups. We're working with pretty small N values here, so we're not observing a lot of significance, but we are observing patterns that are pretty similar, where for both whites and Latinos, it looks like that contact is positively associated with participation only for those who have high levels of injustice. For Black Americans, we see a similar relationship, except that we see for those who have contact and who have very low levels of perceived injustice, that is where we see sort of negative relationship with participation relative to those who don't have contact. Similar set of findings in the ANES, with the exception that among Black Americans, it looks like really perceived discrimination in this data set is doing the work, and that contact has an intercept effect, where those who have contact, so those with discrimination are likely to participate at higher levels without than those who don't have a sense of discrimination, but that effect is heightened for those with contact. When thinking about Latinos, things start to get a little weird, right? I'm not seeing very much difference here in terms of the ANES, in terms of how contact is impacting behavior. And actually, if we pull out the ANES and the NCPS, the subsamples of Latinos, and we put those side by side and we try to look at them and see if we can read the tea leaves and try to draw some conclusions about the relationship between contact, injustice, and participation, we're not seeing a whole lot, right? We're not seeing a whole lot. And so that could be for a couple of reasons, right? For one thing, it could be that we just have a very small sample of Latinos in both the NCPS and the ANES. In particular, in the NCPS, I think it's like about 200 respondents. So it's a very small sample. Another reason why it could be is that I've argued that Latinos are most likely to become mobilized when they connect their experiences to targeting for reasons related to immigration. And in both the NCPS and the ANES, our measure of proximal contact was very, very broad and in reference to policing and the criminal justice system, irrespective of immigration. So before we conclude that the theory doesn't hold among Latinos, let's first see if we can examine some of these relationships with an appropriate sample of Latinos drawing on appropriate measures of contact. And so in order to do this, I draw on the Latino National Health and Immigration Survey, which was collected in 2015 by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. It has a sample size of about 1,400 Latinos, and almost 500 of them are non-citizens. Okay, so what are these two graphs showing us? So just really quickly, in the LNHIS, to measure proximal contact, we asked individuals whether or not they'd ever had a family member or loved one who'd been detained and threatened with deportation for reasons related to immigration. And then to measure perceived injustice, we have a measure of perceived discrimination, which is similar to the one that we used from the ANES. And so what we can see here is that having proximal contact is statistically and positively associated with perceived discrimination. Both proximal contact and perceived discrimination are statistically and positively associated with non-voting participation. And then when we run that moderation analysis again, we have a set of findings that are really similar to those that we observed in the ANES and the NCPS, where we see that positive relationship between contact and participation only when it's combined with perceptions of injustice, or in this case, perceived discrimination. And in the absence of perceived discrimination, there's no real impact of contact on the likelihood of participating. And again, importantly, it's a set of patterns that are similar to those that we observed in the NCPS and the ANES. Okay, so just to sum up where we've been, I began with the question, under what conditions are individuals mobilized, by their experiences with the criminal justice system, and under what conditions are they demobilized. I've argued and I've offered evidence to suggest that individuals become mobilized when they externalize their experiences with the system, rather than internalizing them as a product of a personal failure or their own poor choices. They externalize those experiences and they connect them to a larger narrative of an injustice that centers their group affiliation, their group identity. I further offered evidence that the mobilizing potential of feelings of injustice extends across all three racial groups under study. In-depth interviews highlight the unique challenges that are faced by Black and Latinx people with which whites simply do not contend. But it is also true that all three groups commonly understand the injustice of the system through the extent to which it is profit-driven, and with wealth, one can evade its grasp. So in sum, even as the criminal justice system creates deep, lasting racial cleavages, it creates fertile ground for multiracial coalitions to contest its legitimacy. Interactions with punitive policies like the criminal justice system, like immigration enforcement, are interpretive. Rather than feeding back as alienation from the political system, discontent with punitive policy is potential political power. And so with that, I want to conclude with one final note from quote from Dina. She said, the way that we just accept that the violence that is perpetrated through the system is okay is, it's just unacceptable. It is completely unacceptable. This idea that saying that we matter is a form of resistance of prisons, and like resisting prisons is a form of saying that we matter. And so with that, I'll conclude, and I'm happy to take any questions that you've got.
Thank you, Dr. Walker. That was really, really informative. And one of the questions I'd like to start with, and I think it's very important that we do this, is can you define the two acronyms ANES and NCPS?
Yes, sir. Yes. My apologies for not being clear. The ANES is the American National Election Study. And so for those in the crowd who may be unfamiliar with this, the American National Election Study is a survey that's been conducted since like the 1950s, and it's conducted every election cycle, and it's considered the gold standard of polling. So that's why I'm using it to validate the findings in the NCPS. The NCPS stands for the National Crime and Politics Survey, and that's a survey that I fielded in 2013, especially for this project.
Thank you for that clarification. And also, you use those to quantify your research, but on your personal, where do you stand? I mean, tell us where you stand on that, because that's very important, because you put all this data together as you see it. How do you see it?
How do I see this, the criminal justice system? Is that what you're asking me?
Yes, the whole, all your findings. What is your personal input on it?
Well, I think my personal, let's see, how can I answer this question? I think the thing that I've taken away the most from this project is that last piece that I said, which is that people who have become involved with the criminal legal system are a latent political force. They're very often barred from voting because of felon disenfranchisement laws. And, you know, there are lots of reasons why they might want to withdraw from voting, but all of that is about institutional overlook and institutional neglect. And these are folks who have a political voice, who have political interests. And the thing that I'm most interested in is trying to find out how I can help amplify that political voice. And
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's how I'd like to best answer that question.
Go on if you have more.
I guess the only other thing to say is that, you know, I learned a lot from my interviewees, and Dina's kind of final statement about the inherent violence of the system is something that I've also walked away with, thought a lot about, and spend a lot of time in my classroom talking to my students about.
Thank you. Another question is in participation with mutual aid. I'm sorry, that's not the one I wanted to read. What is the one there was one that, oh, there it is. In participation with the mutual aid network, or in the labor unionization or mobilization, sometimes something that was that included? In other words, unions striking and doing the things that they do. We just saw a big thing with the truckers from Canada doing their thing. So was that included in your research?
Well, in the surveys, we just asked questions like, how likely are you to do the following? And it would be like attend a protest, sign a petition, attend a city council meeting, that kind of thing. And so we didn't ask specifically about union membership. Also, in the case studies that I developed throughout the book, I didn't specifically, do any ethnographic work or any interviews with people with union organizations. There are people who I interviewed who, when I asked them, like, how are you becoming, if you're politicized, how does that express itself? And they said, I'm organizing my workplace. So Jared who a quote I offered, that was his thing. He was like ready to unionize his workplace and build worker power. And then the other one place where I did do some ethnographic work is with a union of sorts, but it was with a day worker center in Seattle, which functions like a union for documented workers in the city. But just to speak to, I think, the heart of the larger question, unions are a good example of the kind of community-based organization that Robbie or Professor Madrigal was mentioning when we first started chatting, that create opportunities for participation and can help organize people who have had experiences with the criminal legal system.
Thank you. Mary?
I was going to step in there with one question, Stan, and it has less to do with your actual research, Professor Walker, and it's wonderful. Your research was just spot on in terms of the kinds of things that we have been discussing on this in this forum. But I'm wondering, many times our students think that we just kind of were born wanting to deconstruct the criminal justice system. I think people know that that's just not so. But I'm always fascinated, and I think our almost 200 students who are joining us today would be interested to know the arc of your career. How did you begin this particular journey? As a white woman, I think we all have to acknowledge that you're doing work in race, and you're white appearing anyway.
Yes, I am white. Yes.
Okay, so I'm just curious, as I think many of our students are, especially since you appear to be, you look like our students. You're as young as our students, which can be a burden. I've never had that problem, but it can be a burden. So would you let us know a little bit about how you got to be from, let's say, birth to where you are today?
Yes, yeah. And since you said from birth, I was just sitting here thinking, like, how much of my personal story do I get into the
please, and please feel free to say as little or much as you can. And I hope it's not too personal a question, but it does speak to your professional choices, correct?
Absolutely, yeah. And it's an appropriate question, which I'm happy to answer. So, so first of all, yes, I am white. And I was raised in a poor white community, but a poor white rural community in Washington State. So that's my sort of origin space. And because I was raised in a poor white community, I'm a first-gen college student. Within the context of that community, my dad was he's a blue collar working class guy. Within the context of the community, that probably makes us more like middle class, but just understanding that's my location in that community. Because of that and the community where I was raised, I was very interested in issues related to poverty and inequality. So that's kind of where it started for me, was wanting to work on issues related to poverty and inequality. And right out of high school, I graduated in 2005. And you guys will be, some may remember that in the summer of 2005, Hurricane Katrina hit. And And so right out of high school, the first thing that I did was I went down to New Orleans and I worked in New Orleans and did disaster relief after Hurricane Katrina. And I did that for about a year. And so doing that work there awakened me to issues related to racial inequality, right? So that was my first exposure to racialized inequality, racialized poverty. So then I start adding to my things that I'm thinking about is, okay, first it's in many ways similar to my interviewees where they start with class, right? So start with the class narrative, and then I start to add race onto that. And I want to work on issues related to poverty and addressing racial inequality and poverty. And but at that point, I had no education, and no one would listen to me or put me in any kind of give me any real work to do. So I went back to Washington State, and I went to school, and I started out at community college and ended up getting my bachelor's degree from Washington State University, Vancouver, which is a commuter campus that Clark College feeds into. And so as I was, so I finished my undergrad, and again, still thinking about poverty and inequality, but starting to realize like, oh, if I want to do any kind of real meaningful work in government or nonprofit space, I'm going to have to go get a master's degree. So I ended up getting my master's of public policy at Rutgers University. And as part of that master's program, you have to go out and do real world work. You can't just stay in the classroom. And so I ended up working with the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, which is located in Newark, New Jersey. And at the time that I was working with them, and still is the case now, they were working on issues related to prisoner reentry. But I was just a little policy intern. I had like no power or anything. And so they had me working on everything that the Institute was doing. And the Institute had a three-pronged approach. They have a research arm, they have a legal advocacy arm, and they have a direct services arm. And so they were having me work with all three of those arms. They were having me do things like extensive lit reviews for the legal team. They were having me collect original data for the research team. And then they were also having me do intakes with their direct services arm, really all hands on deck situation. They were having me do all kinds of things. So it was really a data download of the American criminal justice system. And I became convinced through that experience that the American carceral state is at the center of persistent poverty and inequality, and in particular, racialized poverty and inequality. So once I arrived at that conclusion, I knew I would not be working on anything else for the rest of my life, that in some capacity I'll be working on issues related to criminal justice. So that's where that sort of topical interest started.
Thank you. On a personal note, I just want to say, Robbie, you have a question?
Thank you
please
for
go
that
ahead.
answer, Hannah. That was great.
Please, Stan, ask your question, please.
Oh, I just want to say on a personal note, I went, when I was a young man, I went to Cancun. And when I returned, I went through customs and I was very poorly mistreated. I was with a white young lady, a Hispanic man, and myself. So the mod squad, we were coming in from Cancun from a vacation, had a wonderful time. And right as I got off the plane, got to customs, they put the dog on me.
Oh my gosh.
And not they put the dog on me because that I had nothing to hide, so I was comfortable. So no problem, but the guy controlling the dog was persistent. He was not gonna let that dog get off of me. And not only that, he tapped my chest, and the dog literally put his two front paws on my chest, and he was on his hind legs with his paws on my chest. And of course, I don't have nothing to hide, no drugs, no nothing. So the dog didn't find anything, and the dog's like looking at him like, what do you want me to do? And then finally the dog got down, and he moved back, and he's looking at me, and he has this really disdain look on his face. And he asked me, he said, and I'm looking at him like, are you crazy? And what's going on? And he asked me, do you have a problem? And I said, no, I don't, you do. And through the whole process, his other agents were looking at him like, what's going on? And then finally, he asked me for some ID. Well, I happen to be a firefighter. So when I pulled my ID out, I took my wallet out, I showed him my license. And he said, and he persistently was walking around me. Then he did a pat search on me. Then he turned around and he said, "Do you have any additional ID?" And I flapped my badge. And all of a sudden, everything changed. Expression on his face changed. Everything, and he backed off a little bit and he goes, "Why did you tell me that in the beginning?" And I'm like, "I shouldn't have to tell you that." And so what happened was I got through the process. I know they're looking because a year later, I get a letter asking, did I want to file a claim against US Customs?
Oh, interesting.
That was very interesting to me. I thought, my goodness, somebody was watching that whole process. Not only were they watching that process, they knew my name.
Yeah.
They knew my name. And the white girl, after we finished the whole process, we were sitting in the lobby waiting for a ride to get home. And she was sitting in the lobby and she was confused about the whole thing. And she asked the Hispanic guy, he says, "Why did they do that to him?" And the Hispanic guy says, "Are you kidding me? He's Black." And if you stand here and watch, you'll see that Blacks are treated disproportional to others coming from vacation. And so I just wanted to say that because I think the students need to know that there's issues out there that are out of our control. And I will say this here, one of the things you did mention, and I will say this, politics plays a huge role in how our American system reacts to different things. In other words, our last president made it clear that ICE could do whatever they wanted to, go out and get them type of, and he verbally said that. And so Hispanic America went on, I mean, they said there was a mass exodus. And so politics plays a huge role. I just wanted to say that I'm glad that in your research, you saw how politics plays its heavy role in what's going on. Go ahead, Robbie.
Yeah, thank you, Stan. Thank you for your comments.
Thanks, Stan. Professor Walker, in your book, there's one chapter about community-based organizations, and that was my favorite chapter. And you talk about how individuals who have proximal or personal contact with the carceral system, when they engage with these CBOs, I believe you term it cognitive liberation or insurgent consciousness. Could you describe like the mechanism or process behind that?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me just start by defining terms. Cognitive liberation and insurgent consciousness are both terms that are developed by sociologists to talk about the same set of processes that I'm talking about when I talk about perceived injustice, right? So we could use those things kind of interchangeably. We could use those terms interchangeably. And so in the book, in talking about the role of community-based organizations, and I see that that community-based organizations can be especially powerful for people who have themselves experienced contact with the criminal justice system, because they're natural points of contact for people who are trying to re-enter society, who maybe need to get some kind of assistance. Maybe they need to get a driver's license. Maybe they're Spanish speaking and they need help navigating the legal process. These are the kinds of reasons why people might seek out community-based organizations. Then once they've reached out to and contacted and made contact with those community-based organizations, those community-based organizations may speak to their material needs, which are important in terms of whether or not people are going to become mobilized, but they also can help them connect the experiences that they've had, their individual level experiences, to larger narratives of injustice. They can put them in contact with lots of other people who have had similar experiences, which helps people understand, like, oh, this isn't about me, this is about us. Right? This is about the way that we are constructed and targeted as a group. But they also provide routine opportunities for people to actually participate. And some organizations actually invite their clients to come along, or invite the community members who they work with to come along to engage in those efforts, to go to the State House and talk to legislatures, to go protest outside of a detention center, which was what the Day Worker Center in Seattle, the folks at the Day Worker Center in Seattle used to do very often, was go protest outside the Northwest Detention Center. And so they become these natural spaces of organizing, and that sort of cognitive liberation, sense of injustice, that's a sort of key individual political psychological piece that's required to empower people, to take them away from feeling like, oh, this I did, this is my own fault, and to instead move into a space of thinking there's actually nothing wrong with me, there's something wrong with the system, and if we work together we can create political change. And I think that's the last most important piece about CBOs, is that they can also help demonstrate through past victories to the folks that they work with that change is possible, that actually working together can have a meaningful outcome.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you. One of the questions that was been delivered is, how do they get away with paying inmates only 33 cents an hour?
Okay, yeah. So the first thing that I want to say, well, okay, I'll start with, they can get away with paying inmates 33 cents an hour because of the loophole in the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment technically abolished slavery, but if you read the text of the 13th Amendment, there's a caveat there for people who are paying reparations because of a crime that they've committed, right? And so, so that's the sort of legal loophole that makes that possible. And if your students are interested in hearing much more about that, I'm sure if you haven't heard of it, but Ava DuVernay put together a documentary on Netflix called 13th, which really does a very nice job of explaining the 13th Amendment and making accessible the connection between slavery and modern day mass incarceration, right? So that we can say that mass incarceration is the new Jim Crow, but sometimes sometimes I think the institutional linkages can be lost on people, and that documentary does a very good job of identifying those institutional linkages. So that's the first thing I want to say. The other thing that I want to say is that we should not only focus on inmates who are only getting paid 13 cents an hour for work that they do. And the reason that we should not only focus on that is because there's actually a very small proportion of inmates for whom that's true. But that doesn't mean that there aren't lots of other ways, and there aren't lots of other ways that prisons are making money off of that warehousing of human bodies. That's what I want to say, right? So if we only focus on the people who are making 13 cents an hour, we're only viewing a very small part of the picture.
And you also made statement of that when you stated that the whole system, those that make profit from that system are very only ones that get rewarded from the system, and that's very true.
Yeah,
you know,
that was
just get a DUI and see what the cost is and who's involved.
Yes, that was the perspective of my interviewee for sure. Yeah.
Very good. I have another question. It says, I work with the justice involved in individuals within the San Bernardino County jails. What I have witnessed is that there needs to be a dedicated balance between personal responsibility and acceptance of environmental factors which influence their life trajectory, such as systematic oppression of lower SES and rationalization groups. What are some things you would wish to impart on those who are not proximately but directly involved with the criminal justice system?
I mean, I think when we're talking about personal responsibility versus environmental factors, what we're talking about is what leads people to commit crime. And what I want to make clear is that my research is not concerned with why people commit crimes. My research is concerned with prisons. My research is concerned with policing. So I don't have a lot to say in terms of like, why do people commit crimes? What are, appropriate ways to address underlying criminal behavior? That's something that I don't have expertise in. So what would I want folks who have become involved with the criminal legal system to know, based on my expertise and from the vantage point from which I sit? What I would want them to know is I would want them to know that very often they do have the right to vote. That even if they think that they don't have the right to vote, that's probably not true. People who are housed in jails, who haven't been convicted of a felony, can still vote, and they can vote from inside jail. And so no state bars that, as far as I know. And so what I would want people to know is I would want them to know in as full-throated way as possible the rights that they do have access to. And I would want them to know how best they can exercise those rights. So, a project that I'm working on right now, I'm going to just go ahead and use this as an opportunity to talk about my current research. A project that I'm working on right now tries to do just this. It's a get out the vote experiment that tries to see if we can reach and contact people who may have felony convictions but are nevertheless eligible to vote because they've served the terms of their sentence, and then tries to give them the information about how to go get registered and tell them and educate them to the fact that they're eligible to do so. And in this project, we found that those kinds of outreach efforts are successful, that people with felony convictions are responsive to that it heightens their levels of registration and their levels of voter turnout. And I think that's really exciting. So if I had one sort of piece of knowledge that I would want people who have experienced incarceration to have, it would be that their political voices matter, that very often they can exercise it, even if they think that they can't, and then the logistical information for how to make that happen.
Thank you for saying that, because that's so important that people need to know that their vote really does matter. Everyone says it's one vote, but it really does matter. And we've seen it in past elections, and I know we'll see it in future elections. On my personal note it's you say the new Jim Crow, and I just call it the continual Jim Crow, because it's been nonstop. And so every time we start all over again, everyone says the new Jim Crow, but talk about the continual Jim Crow. In other words, from Jim Crow to today, it's actually been ongoing. So please talk about that a little bit.
Okay. And what I will talk about it. What I'll mostly do also is point the audience to other resources that can give you a much more granular insight into this. And so, and again, Ava DuVernay's 13th does a really good job of this, right? Where, in the wake of the abolition of slavery and Reconstruction, what we got almost immediately, we got two things almost immediately. We got felon disenfranchisement laws, and then we also got what are referred to as the black codes, which basically is the criminalization of, so painting in broad strokes, it's the criminalization of being Black in public. But what it looks like in practice is the criminalization of things that we still deal with, right? Things like loitering, things like homelessness, so these sort of, and other kinds of really things like jaywalking, really, really, really like low level infractions that really probably shouldn't even merit contact with a police officer, right? But they do. And those kinds of policies are seated in, particularly in the South, the desire to continue to manage the Black population in the absence of slavery. And that also manifests itself in Jim Crow laws, right? Which codify segregation and criminalize the violation of those laws that establish segregation. But it's not only in the South. What we can see is that in the North, so just like a brief history overview, and I know that this is the Department of History and there are historians on this call, and I'm gonna get it wrong. So for sure, correct me, and I apologize in advance for my overly broad strokes. But after Reconstruction and the establishment of the Jim Crow South, Black Americans start migrating to the North in droves in search of a better life for themselves and in search of work outside the South. And what they are met with pretty immediately is the criminalization of the urban space and very heavy-handed policing tactics that are specifically designed to criminalize Black communities in the North. And so I think the book that I like the best that talks about this transition and also traces the transition of policing in northern cities to modern day policing tactics is The Condemnation of Blackness by Khalil Gibran Muhammad, who's a historian at Harvard. It's a very wonderful book that spells out in very clear terms how we get from the Jim Crow South to the criminalization of Black communities in the North, and that those policing strategies that live with us today, that inform modern policing tactics.
Thank you. Mary, anybody else have anything they would like to ask?
I was just going to, thank you, Stan. I was just going to add to that very thoughtful question, that last question that you just read. And just to underscore what Dr. Walker is saying, you know, her focus when you do research, when you are a university professor and one of your things is to do research, many of us focus on the macro as opposed to the micro. You know, we don't look at, you know, trying to prevent 7-Eleven from getting robbed by, you know, by neighborhood criminals. So we look at these big institutions, and I would just, if the person who asked the question, if he would just look up in the last year or so, or maybe the last 5 years, the stuff that's been written about Rikers Island. And we had Akeem Browder on a few weeks ago, and he is the brother of Khalif Browder, who was incarcerated in Rikers Island now for like he was incarcerated without an arraignment, not even, you know, let's not talk about trial, without an arraignment. And he was beaten, he was in isolation for most of that time, and got out and commit suicide. Those are the kinds of things that people like Dr. Walker and myself, you know, we look at what the institution does to the individual, as opposed to what the individual is doing to themselves or to the institution. And so I've always felt like it is much more important for me in terms of my worldview, is to look at these institutions and what they are doing. Rikers Island is a disaster. Yeah, and everyone agrees that it is, yet they cannot close it. They cannot close it. And it makes the individual, like Khalif Browder's brother, feel helpless, because everyone knows what's going on behind those gates. Yet we still can't close Rikers Island. And Rikers might be just a metaphor for all of the other, you know, starting with, you know, not starting with, but certainly Attica in the 1970s and coming forward. And it is simply too important not to focus on the institutional systemic problems of the criminal justice system.
Yeah, thank you for that, Mary. I 100% agree. And I think that's a really important distinction to make, right? The micro versus the macro.
Thank you. Professor Walker, thank you so much for joining us this week. Very informative, lots of information to take in. And Robbie, I'm glad you read the book, because I mean, it's so much information, and there you go, show the book. And I tell the students that are here, just take a look at the book. It's got so much information, so much analytical information that breaks it down. And I think you should read it. It's a good book. I'm sure Robbie read it, and so I think we should thank you for being here. Look forward to your future works, and thank you for your time.
Thank you.
And please,
Thank you so much.
Oh, did she leave?
No,
I'm here.
Oh, there you are. Oh, I missed you. I think I just want to encourage you. I think you're, you know, at the beginning of your career. And I think the work that and I'm at the end of my career, but I do want to encourage you to continue this work. It's good work. And it is only through voices like yours and others that we can literally change the system. In the past, you know, people who were in academia were not supposed to get personally involved. You know, we were not supposed to use the personal pronoun I and, you know, those kinds of things. But I think we know now, we see that the situation is dire in many areas that we examine. And I think you should just keep at it and don't let anyone encourage you. And I applaud you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mary. Thank you, Stan. Thank you, Robbie. Thank you for having me. You guys have really had a lovely time. And if there's anything else I can do for you, please don't hesitate to reach out and let me know.
Don't tell us that. Don't tell us that, because we will harass you.
Thank you for your work in New Orleans. That must have been
Yeah, that
very
was wonderful.
rewarding.
Yeah.
It was formative. That's for sure. Maybe someday if we ever have a chance to have coffee, I'll tell you more about it.
Sounds good. That's my hometown.
Coffee or
so I'm
gelato.
interested.
Gelato, that's right.
Yeah,
Yeah, gelato.
gelato.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Hannah.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.